Horse archers alone are not the way. I have read tips online about how horse archers are overpowered, and where this is true on normal and easy difficulties, I've really struggled to find a workable strategy with just horse archers on the harder difficulties. See, on something such as impossible mode, you need both mounted knights and horse archers to create your effective strategy. Doing it with horse archers alone just kind of isn't possible. I mean, as you can see here, I send in my knights to quickly destroy the structure while my horse archers destroy the enemies. And with this method, I can very quickly achieve a very easy victory. Also, do note my catapults down here. On the point of catapults, I find them to be a very weak offensive weapon, but it is handy leaving just a few of them in your more valuable circles as a bit of added defense. Their splash damage is very good on the enemies as they bunch up around the gate. You only need 5 workers per circle. On impossible mode, resources don't respawn so quickly, so you only need 5 workers per circle to keep them occupied. On normal difficulty, have around 8 workers per circle. Things respawn a lot more quickly on easier modes, so having around 8 workers keeps them mostly busy most of the time. The knight has the best health versus resources invested, and knowing that comes in very handy when you're playing on impossible mode. On easier modes, horse archers are slightly overpowered because they hit their targets more often than regular archers and archer towers. Plus, horse archers do a fair amount of damage to the enemy when compared to other projectile units. Archers alone are very weak. This is because they have very little health and are very poor shots if the enemy is not stood still. When you send in melee fighters, it forces the enemy to stand still, which allows the archers to more correctly do their job. Extra lives are kind of useful. From the start, extra lives may seem like a waste of resources. However, these are regular guards that have been leveled up to royal guards, which is very difficult to do. They each have 2,000 health along with a relatively large damage output. By giving them an extra life, you are essentially doubling their health, which makes them even more powerful than they already are. These highly leveled troops do a great job of destroying this very strong group of dragons. Clear structures around valuable circles. Near the beginning of the game, here are 2 of my circles. Notice how these enemy circles have buildings. If I want to keep one of my circles over a longer period of time, I will have to try to remove these buildings. This is because the most repeated and overwhelming attacks will come from enemy circles with buildings in them. The water and poison areas are pretty good buffer zones. Enemies move slow in water and they die in poison. It is especially fun when the enemies take a poison zone only to die off or abandon it. You can then easily retake it and the situation goes on, distracting the enemy while you take down other circles. Just to point out that water zones act as good buffers, you can see here I've placed my only buildings very near my fortified circle. This would look far better if the enemy attack had more melee units, but you get the idea. These enemies, they flounder around in the water, moving very slowly, while my archer towers take them down. Tactics do matter in circle empires. More angles of attack means an easier victory. Here, in this boss fight, I attack with large armies from 3 directions. The enemy has to divide its defenses. They don't have time to bottleneck my armies, and so the boss dies quickly and with very few losses to my side. Place more than 1 storehouse. I say this because slow-moving workers such as the zombie or golem will become more efficient if they have less distance to travel. Plus, it's a cheap way of giving the enemies another target to hit. Shoot from your own circle to provoke attacks. The fact you can shoot from behind your own gates gives you a very easy edge over your non-thinking computer-controlled opponents. You don't have to mount a full invasion. You can just send in a few workers and while they are in combat, your projectile units will fire from their nearby positions. Your units heal over time, and more so when they are in their own territory, so your missile units have yet another slight advantage. Here is an easy example. My workers start to attack the fence, and my projectile units start destroying the base. The enemy circle only has workers, so they flee while I take on an easy victory. Click and hold to spawn many units at once. Here I'm orchestrating a large attack where you can see just how powerful fire is, especially on the harder difficulties. On the right here, if you click and hold, it deploys spawns of many units, as many as your resources will allow. As you can tell, this allows you to quickly build reinforcements for your attacks. Also, if you have your big army somewhere else, you can spawn a bunch of units where you're being attacked. This will hopefully slow down the enemy attack, so your larger army has a chance to get over there and hopefully repel the invasion. Double-clicking units is fidgety. If you are trying to select your workers, just send your troops to a different circle. Fighting units are always selected first. Your workers are much easier to box around and select if there are no fighters in the circle. Double-clicking is fine, but in this, the original version of Circle Empires, double-clicking is always troubling. There is a sort of trick to it. You have to click the very outer edge of the unit in order to select it. Maybe don't double-click in the very center of the unit because it won't select. You have to select around the edge of the unit with at least the second click, which can be tricky if the unit is moving around all over the place. Keep healers away from the battles. Healers are just too darn expensive to waste. You need to bring in the healers after the battle is won. See, in later versions of Circle Empires, you can sit your healers next to your archers, but in this, the first version of the game, it's not a good battle tactic. As you can see there with this oversized army, the healers come in and they quickly fix up the army so that they're ready for the next battle. Impossible mode will teach you to heavily fortify at least one circle. As you expand outwards, consider leaving a pumpkin in that area, letting them grow, and then later in the game, when you need a big burst of food, you can send in a huge group of workers to harvest it up. Grouping is a big help. Hold Ctrl and press a number and it sets a group. Press that number and the group is selected. This is good for keeping things like your archers in one circle and your melee units running in for the attack. Sometimes the menu gets stuck and you cannot reach the one you want. If so, press E to change the menus. Quick Save is F5 and Quick Load is F7. Do not grow attached to your circles. Be of a mind to simply let your circles go. This is not the sort of RTS game where you build a lot of stuff, and you don't really lose that much when you lose a circle. In fact, in many cases, all you lose is a tower or two and maybe a few workers, especially if you've already stripped the area of all of its resources. What really matters is how many resources you have on hand, since they are what you use to spawn an army, and with which you can quickly mount a retaliation if needs be. If you try to defend every circle, you may quickly find yourself overwhelmed because the enemies are they're not going to play by your rules. A mix of towers is the best long-term solution. One of each tower is enough to inflict damage over time to a cluster of enemies. You can see here, just these 3 towers do a lot of damage to the enemies as they arrive, especially here where they group together in this bottleneck. Even on impossible mode, just fire and arrow towers alone can fend off most attacks. The fire is seemingly overpowered, but it's the arrows that finish off the enemies so they have less time to cause havoc. However, later in the game, this method may not hold up. As you can see here, the dragons make very short work of my wooden towers and my fire towers. Groups of void queens may be overpowered. Take this example here on impossible mode. It costs a lot to have this many void queens, but look at what happens. They spawn all these little beasts, which I can use to easily attack the next circle and win a second divisive victory. Sadly, on the third attack, they are taken down by, well, you guessed it, the golden dragons. In hindsight, I should have only sent the void queens into the other circle. I should have left the bug creatures in my circle and used the healing mushroom trick to keep them alive. Nevertheless, there is the power of the void queen. You can harass enemies with your towers. Workers won't retaliate from enemy circles if you harass them with projectile units. Don't forget that if you actually invade a circle, then the workers will fight back and cause damage to your troops. However, harassing them in this manner is pretty safe. This is perhaps not so when you're playing the sequels to this game, and especially when you're fighting against human players. But the AI computer-controlled players in this version of the game, well, they're maybe not so smart. Create and defend choke points. The map layout allows you to defend choke points. Here is an easy example on experienced difficulty. Enemies only enter my territory from here, here, and here, so I have heavily defended this vulnerable position with lots of towers and a wall. Then, the other location down here, this is where I keep my standing army as I push out further into the map. If things start going wrong, I can pull back to this position and defend my way, moving back through my own territory. How to use the Altar of Experience. You get the recipe for the Altar of Gold and the Altar of Experience when you fully level up one of your units. Here I am leveling up a healer because they only need to level up once before they become masters. You can also see this grey bar just here. This is the experience indicator, along with the numbers running along the bottom. The healer is fully leveled up. It says it has a new recipe, which we can see up here. This is the Altar for Gold, and this is the Altar for Experience. The most common method is to kite enemies into an area that has 3 altars of experience. You can see the enemies coming in from this side. Now, altars of experience aren't really big game changers, except do keep in mind that when the enemies attack your circle and even take your circle, the altars of experience are not destroyed. So in that way, when you counterattack and you retake the ring, the altar of experience is still going to churn out experience for your troops because you're killing enemies within that circle. So in a way, placing altars of experience in some of your most vulnerable rings is probably a good idea. Play on smaller maps for easier unlocks. You can game the system and unlock stuff more easily if you so wish. For example, here, you need to win the game playing as Mindy the Mushroom to unlock the Mushroom Mage. In this case, you could play on an extra small map size and win it that way. I only mention this because if you want to win the game using Angie the Adventurer, then you may need to play on a smaller map because this hero doesn't allow you to create your own units. As a result, getting through the process can be fairly tricky if you're playing on a larger map. Easy modes offer more gameplay variety. When you are on Impossible mode, the weaker troops are simply unusable, so you find yourself never spawning them. In fact, you can burn through hundreds of them in a matter of seconds. Alternatively, on Impossible mode, you find yourself relying on the mid-range units, such as Knights and Horse Archers. Now, this is not a bad thing, but if you want to play around with a wider range of units, or perhaps try a different series of approaches, then the easier modes are your only options. The game plays very differently depending on the difficulty you choose, my point being that if you want to vary your play style and mix it up a bit, then the easier and the medium difficulties are more for you. Battle distances do have an impact. Closing the distance between you and the enemy is a big part of winning this game. That is why defenders in water biomes always have the advantage, because it takes so long for the attacking troops to reach them. It is also why the location you click is so important. Here, I click the enemy circle very near to the edge of my own circle, and my troops get in there and they start fighting right away. Alternatively, I click here at the far end of the enemy circle, and my troops walk all the way over there before they start fighting. How to beat Impossible mode. Build a bank as soon as possible when you first start the game, and again hopefully when you start a new circle in a fairly safe area. The input of gold from banks is a renewable resource that will carry you through most of the game. Surviving the first attack is pretty much your biggest hurdle. Build an army, and when it's of a reasonable size, save your game. At some point, the map will go wild and the enemies will start attacking. If you fail, reload and try again. The enemy attack pattern may be different next time in a way that allows you to survive. Otherwise, restart the game and try again. Restart and try again if things get too difficult too early. The truth is that sometimes you just roll a map that's too impossible. Select a small group of your units and try to destroy the buildings first whenever you attack. Do this because enemy spawn rates are diabolically fast on Impossible mode. Try to build a few catapults so that you can select all of them and attack and destroy the buildings very efficiently as the enemies try to counterattack you in your own circle. Fire is overpowered in every biome except a water one. This is because fire resistance is not that common, especially when it comes to defensive buildings. Keep in mind that sending a large army all at the same time may result in them dying very quickly by being burned up. This huge army dies in mere seconds. Going into water puts out fire, which also means that water is a good place to fight dragons. You can see here my units stop taking damage when they walk into water. Ice hunters are pretty useless against dragons unless you have a few of them, and unless you have a few of the technology upgrades, after which, if you gather up a reasonable-sized group, they can be very effective at taking down dragons. Their military strength here, and that of the dragons, is almost the same, yet during the attack I only lose very few of my units. Also, make sure that if your heavily fortified base is in one circle, that your initial attack comes from a different direction. That way, your towers are more likely to survive the assault. If you are on a map with dragon layers, try to take them down first. Otherwise, they may just spawn and spawn and spawn dragons, which is really going to make your job difficult later in the game. Enemies don't rebuild their buildings, so once you've taken out the dragon layers, then after a while you can simply eliminate the dragons piecemeal bit by bit. Healing mushrooms give you a fighting edge against fire. A healing mushroom partially or fully restores the health of those within a circle. Here I need a quick influx of gold, so I keep using mushrooms to keep my workers alive. This probably isn't something you should try unless you're really desperate for gold. However, these mushrooms can provide you with a very powerful fighting edge, especially when you are playing on impossible difficulty. This is impossible mode, and over there are some golden dragons, which could easily destroy my army within seconds. So first, I put down a few healing mushrooms over here so that they are easily accessible. My dinosaur is the most fire resistant, so she is going to be my diversion. I send it all the way to the other side of the enemy circle. This should get the battle started and buy me a few more seconds before my army is incinerated. I've just selected a few of my troops and I have them destroy the healing mushrooms one at a time with a fairly brisk pace. As you can see, this keeps almost all of my army alive during the battle. Restarting a map may help. Sometimes your starting area is unlucky, in which case you can go back to the menu and restart. Next time, perhaps you find an easier starting map. It's an especially good idea if you are playing on impossible mode. You can see here, this map is pretty lucky, because, for one reason at least, I'm sat right next to an unguarded area. Also, battle attacks by the enemy are randomized. As a result, if you save whenever you are in a good position, such as with a large army, then if you are attacked, it's possible to reload, after which the enemy may decide to attack a different area. Harvesting the poison forest. Here I have necromancers and zombies. The zombies harvest the poison wood. They die and become aggressive zombies. My necromancers kill them, and they become zombies again. With enough necromancers, you can create a repetitive cycle of dead and living zombies until the poison forest is harvested. There are some units that are poison resistant. Sadly, regular zombies are not. You can put healers in there with your workers, but healing is so random that you will probably still lose some of your units. Seems to me the best unit for harvesting inside of poisonous areas is this creature here, though as you can see it moves really slowly. You can use these too, but only if you pick the leader, Puck the Pumpkin King. In fact, if you spawned in an area where there's a poison circle next door, then this could work quite to your benefit. Attacking from one side. Ideally, you want to launch large attacks from as many sides as possible. However, if you can only attack from one side, then choose a bunch of your melee units and send them in first. As you can see, the projectile enemies do most of the work. Leave some melee units in your circle and they can fight the enemies who wander over to your side. It doesn't sound like much, but if you were to send in your entire army, many of your units would have been lost unnecessarily as they move from one circle to the other. In many cases, most of your casualties occur during the journey, especially if the enemies have area of effect weapons.